These days I am a health policy analyst at the University of London, and I've been studying the NHS reforms. So, what I wanted to talk to you was something really very central. It's the overview of what's been going on, because, you know, that appears to have escaped an awful lot of people. I've spoken to doctors recently that have not realised that this is a health financing reform. That's kind of basic. So, the reason that everybody is very confused, well, it's not accidental. Really, this narrative is not available clearly around this coalition at all. If you look in the Liberal Democrats' orange book, you'll find the clearest thing. But apart from that, it has been deliberately obfuscated. So I saw an activist video back in spring 2011, and I found out there was a problem with the NHS. And so I read the white paper. And it's a bunch of guff about GP empowerment and how everything is going to be wonderful for patients forevermore because of lots of choice. And it's really very vague and waffly. I could see something in there about pharmaceutical pricing, but apart from that, I came out with pretty much no clarity at all about what they're proposing. So because I've got some legal background, I turned to the green paper and read the bill through. It's about 500 pages long, it wasn't fun. And after reading it, I deconstructed it to find out what the mechanisms in it were and what the point of it is. And what I found, briefly, is something that was in the news a couple of weeks ago. Mrs. Thatcher's privatisation plan. She had it written up by a bunch of privatisation specialists, some of whom were her own MPs. And the Adam Smith Institute produced really quite a definitive version of that in 1988. And what it describes is a change in the NHS. All service delivery to be delivered by private providers, and a switch through a social insurance arrangement like they have in continental Europe, through to private health insurance taking over the health services in this country. So what we're talking about as an end state is something pretty similar to the US Medicare and Medicaid systems. A partial subsidised service, and basically the NHS reduced to a logo and a budget. Logo franchised out all over the place, so patients won't be aware, but a complete hollowing out and shutting down of the public sector. So that's what is in the Act that our Parliament passed. The people voting on it, well, some of them are self-interested, so I expect they were shutting their eyes, others seem to be not aware. There was a lot of debate at the time about competition. Andrew Lansley, our former Secretary of State for Health, put a paper in the medical journal, Health Service Journal, in 2011 called "Competition is Essential for the NHS." And in 2005, he was even franker about it. He was speaking to a meeting of private health providers and investors interested in the NHS, and he told them that intending to privatise, make privatisation changes similar to the utilities, that his goal was to get competition introduced right the way through the NHS, and that doing this would bring the NHS activities within the scope of EU competition law, and he was deliberately wanting to do that. That speech is available online. If you Google Lansley 2005 NHS speech, it comes up. I'd welcome people to read that. It's very eye-opening. It's complete contrast to everything he's been saying to the public and the professions. Okay, so competition is central, and there was a lot of debate about it, but there's still an awful lot of confusion, especially among GPs and CCGs who they can't get any clarity on it, and when they ask a straight question, what they get is no, not compulsory, but always worded in a particular kind of way. The situation about whether the market is compulsory and whether EU competition law is going to affect what we do in the NHS is a matter of how the financial transactions underlying the delivery of NHS services are structured. Now, you can do them in lots of kind of ways. Traditionally, different public sector bodies within the parts of them, they shared their budget out within the organisation in a rational manner. That's been abolished, and in future, everything is structured in such a way that if you are a profit-making entity participating in it, you can make a profit out of it. So if it's structured as an economic undertaking, is the actual term, then competition law has to be applied by the government concerned. So if we organise the NHS as a public service and run it like a traditional public service, then competition law does not lock in, and the market does not obtain. If you run everything through markets, then competition law locks in, and basically private providers gain rights to participate in the competition for a share of the available public money. That's what it comes down to. And they managed to write those things. They wrote competition law, they wrote trade law, they wrote the US equivalent of antitrust law, and it's all stacked in their favour. It looks like it's a level playing field, but you start to look at it a bit, it's not. So the competitive market is central. But most of the people who have tried to find where the competitive market comes into the bill and the Act have found it very difficult to locate it. And when the government has been challenged head-on about it, they will say there is no obligation in the Act to use competitive markets. Now, as very, very often in official statements about the NHS at the moment, that is strictly true, but highly misleading. Because what it says, and it took me a little while to find this, but I was looking for it. I'm trained in pulling apart laws and finding out how they work, and then in gaming them. I used to be in the profession that is in trouble at the moment, sort of tax planning and privatisation, all of that stuff. So I used to be one of the people that reads laws and finds out ways to go against the public interest in order to exploit them for money. I'm a reformed character. So that's very strictly true, and in fact the mechanism is reduced to a couple of sentences, and they look really very anodyne. They're in section 75, and what they say is commissioning will be conducted under regulations to be issued, pretty much, and that's all it is. That is the key to the Act.
Regulations to be issued.
To be issued.
Statutory instruments.
Statutory instruments, indeed, thank you. The regulations are being presented this week. We have 40 days to try and object. Now, they go through Parliament through what's called a negative process, which means that if nobody does anything, they just pass through. They don't get debated or anything. This is all very quiet. And it's been carefully structured that way because there was all of that fuss about the Act. And we couldn't get the Labour Party to engage with this issue. I met the people in charge, and there was even a lawyer there who understood the issues, and I don't know why, but they didn't engage with it. I have spent 2 years attempting to address this, and finally it's done. People are understanding because the regulations are on the table and there's been an official consultation, so people see that they're important. So, the significance of those regulations and the content of them. There has been a lot of questions now about what's in those regulations, and again, an awful lot of official kind of dodging the question. And it turns out, because I've had an argument with a lot of people about whether or not anything definitive has been said, that something was, but although it can be in the public domain, it looks as though it didn't get into the public domain, despite my personal attempts to cause it to. This was a letter by Earl Howe, who was the Secretary of State for Health of the House of Lords, so Lansley's counterpart in the Lords.
Still is, sorry.
Yes, and he's a professional lawyer, and he's very slick with words. And he admitted what was going to be in the regulations, and he said it in such a way as to try and diffuse resistance still. He said, we're just going to use the same regulations that the former government put in place. And that shut a lot of people up, unfortunately. But if you look at what the regulations were that the former government put in place, there's 2010 regulations, and they're the same as the 2007 regulations, which were introduced by Mark Britnell under the Labour government, World Class Commissioning it's called, and those necessarily mirror the EU 2006 procurement rules, which are part of the competition law. So the exact same law has been transported from the EU canon to this country's regulations, which weren't compulsory in 2007 and 2010. And what happens in about 40 days after now is that those regulations will become the law of this country, with the Cooperation and Competition Panel part of Monitor adjudicating when private companies take CCGs to court for not having given them, as they feel, a fair shake, a fair chance at winning that money. Every CCG and every GP, or every CCG that has sort of gone on record and said we're opposing the market, there's going to be a flood of lawsuits as soon as the rules lock in. They don't realise this is coming yet because they don't understand why competition law is a problem. But this is the issue. Okay, so those regulations will force the use of competitive markets by CCGs. For small value contracts, they can use Choose and Book. That's called AQP. Any qualified provider in the UK, it's called any willing provider in the EU and in international trade law. It means any company can sign up across the EU to provide services to the NHS. Every single opportunity has to be advertised. For any amount over around 200,000 euros, any service with a budget of above that, it has to be put out to tender through competitive markets and again advertised so everybody through Europe can apply for it. Winning those bids requires jumping through a lot of hoops. Those bids are not easy to put together well, and of course it's the big companies with the deep pockets and the excellent bid teams, professional bid teams, who they've got legal experts, they've got financial experts, they do nothing but churn them out. I've worked with them in international work. And you talk to people who are charities, people who are public sector teams putting together the bids, and it's one or two people working overtime. And I did an evaluation of commissioning in 2010 in London. I went round and spoke to commissioners. One of the questions we were asking was, are the charities getting a share of this? Of the tendering out that the PCTs were doing of public services? And the answer was, well, we'd really like them to because they're very good for service delivery, but actually no, big companies win the bids. And then they don't deliver very well on services because they are basically really penny pinching. And they stick to the contract when it suits them, and they're not really interested in service delivery or the people. But that's what happens. So that's experience from the horse's mouth. That has never been published. It's too sensitive to publish.
Can you publish it, please?
Sorry?
Can you publish it?
I have tried. I'm not allowed to. I've written
we
about
publish
it.
it?
Who says you're not allowed?
The person in charge of the study. I have a contract. Okay,
I'll
so
tell everyone.
please do. The Earl Howe letter, all other materials I'm happy to share. I've got an enormous library of resources and a network of the other people who know about the different bits of this that I'm not so good on. So if you want help, I'm happy to source information for activism. So my very last point is this. Why is this happening? Well, there is democracy in this room. It flowers afresh. However, our ancestral democracy in Westminster would rather appear to have been sold down the river, quite literally. Taken up residence in the City of London, and there is a committee composed of insurers and bankers and investment firms and various other financial services people, most of whom are very interested in the privatisation industry and have made enormous amounts of money from it internationally. They are very interested in the UK opening all public services up 100% because that helps them. Not only do they get to exploit here, but it helps them use the can opener on other economies around the world. You have to match that. So it's not like the EU is pulling us in this direction. In fact, it is the City of London that has been pushing the EU further in this direction. It's tied very closely with the US multinationals. So, basically, we're privatising things in this country because the city wants them privatised. The city has been involved since two employees of N.M. Rothschild's Merchant Bank in the International Privatisation Unit, named John Redwood MP and Oliver Letwin MP, were closely involved in this plan, and the Adam Smith Institute credits them with that. And the city has been seamlessly implementing this policy for 25 years, which is why the Labour Party did such a lot of bizarre things. Their health policy is seamless with what Thatcher and Major started.
Bang, bang.
Labour continued at least from 2002 when Milburn came in, really. And then the coalition is finishing it off and taking it through to the end. And Letwin made an announcement, an unofficial, accidental one in 2004, because he doesn't have good control of his mouth, that the NHS would be finished within 5 years of a Tory democracy. Tory victory in the election. So we didn't get a Tory victory, but we got some pseudo-Tories to back them up who also want privatisation of everything, according to the Orange Book. And so that's why they're on board. And the final thing is this. In a couple of months, there will be an announcement. There will be a new EU-USA trade treaty. David Cameron has announced that it is his goal for the next 6 months to go to the talks in June and force that through in Europe as well as he can. That's why he's willing to offer us referendums and whatever on some indeterminate time frame. Basically, the EU locks into what's going on in Washington later this year. And we have been speaking to a lady who's been involved in that process. I think she's an ex-trade unionist, but she's somehow been involved officially in the process over a number of years. And she says that although this is about to be announced, it's been in preparation for a couple of years already, and prominent during those talks from the beginning has been the need to harmonise, or the wish to harmonise, all UK systems, EU systems generally, which is why the other healthcare systems in Europe are also being privatised or have already been privatised, with the US system. And she said that the first target for that harmonisation explicitly and repeatedly has been stated to be the health sector. So this is what is happening to the NHS. I'm happy to answer questions.